Hello.
Our story begins with Slave 1 sliding past the massive blockade over Naboo and landing inside the royal hangar bay. From the ship walked a Mandalorian bounty hunter. The young Queen of Naboo sent out a temporary distress signal to the Outer Rim after contacting the capital. She hoped that someone would come to help her, because truthfully speaking, she didn't trust the Republic to do their job. Her closest advisors reassured her that Senator Palpatine would promote their struggle. She trusted Sheev. He was one of her earliest political allies. She just knew that the Senate wasn't reliable. Maybe she'd be endangering herself more by welcoming in other threats, but she had the credits that she would willingly spend if she needed to. What she expected to show up was not Jango Fett. He was a renowned bounty hunter, and currently the greatest in the galaxy. Jango walked with presence, and the Royal Guard stood with their weapons pointed towards him. Captain Panaka kept his trained blaster on the Mandalorian, demanding to know who he was and what he wanted. Even if the Queen sent out a distress signal and they knew about it, they needed to be sure that Jango didn't represent the Federation. He was honestly a little insulted that they thought so little of him, but he confirmed that he had no affiliation with the trade conglomerate, and that he'd like to speak with their Queen. He could offer his services, but it would come at a hefty cost. Captain Panaka lowered everyone's weapons and quickly escorted the bounty hunter from the hangar bay to the throne room. Padmé looked regal in her red cloaks, and she spoke with an upper-class dialect, requesting for Jango to do anything. The Republic wouldn't be able to aid her, and she needed someone to protect the capital. Well, he shrugged his shoulders. That was beyond his capabilities. He couldn't promise her anything. This was a full-blown invasion. Yet he could assure her success in other forms. She was intrigued. Jango explained that the Federation had a system when they invaded a planet. She watched him pensively, and he removed his helmet, laying it gently on her table. He told her that Federation leadership liked to accompany their battle droids because they wanted to feel empowered. Since Naboo had no real threat on the surface, Nute Gunray himself with his closest allies would land inside the capital. He then asked her if there were catacombs under the city. She nodded without hesitating. Jango suggested moving herself down there and giving him command over her royal guard. He knew how to negotiate with the monarchs, and even though Padmé was extremely young, he wasn't going to take advantage of his own experience with royals. This was a negotiable deal, and if Amidala saw that he respected her, despite the age difference, she might pay him more anyways. There were layers to this. The Queen was reasonably cautious of Jango, especially with her advisors shutting down this idea immediately, and Panaka backing up the advisors. But she was optimistic. She walked over to Jango, away from the window, and asked him to walk her through everything. Padmé knew that she had to have every detail and see the dedication in his eyes before ever agreeing to his plan. He was, after all, the only bounty hunter that did show up for this job, and it wasn't by coincidence. Jango knew his reputation was great at this point. Doing this would only benefit it. If royals knew that there was a bounty hunter that they could rely on, he could get away from lower-paying scum jobs for the Hutts and find people to work for that had far more credits than the majority of power in the Outer Rim. So he told her everything he planned on doing, exactly how he'd execute it, and the few scenarios he expected to come from it, not to mention the potential success it would bring her. Jango expressed openly that he wouldn't want public gratification on Naboo. He just wanted someone to support him if he wanted to work with other royals. It was a simple transaction. This didn't cover payment, and he got to that next. He had a large asking price, and Padmé agreed to a deal where they'd pay him half upfront and the other half after the fact. She did add a clause that would remove credits if buildings were damaged or people were killed. Padmé did tell him that she wouldn't raise arms against the Federation during their invasion, and he had no problem with that. It was the perfect deal to him. Their first payments were handed over. He put the credits in the Slave 1 and hid the ship elsewhere in a private bay for the Queen to use, outside the royal hangar bay. He didn't need to have his ship damaged by battle droids. After several hours of waiting and planning, the Trade Federation arrived. Jango Fett put everyone where he wanted them. They were all situated inside and throughout the palace. As the Queen wanted, their people put up no fight, and the Federation marched through the streets with thousands of battle droids. Nute Gunray and his cohorts arrived via shuttle. and they rightfully expected a surrender. He was going to go to the throne room to find the queen and capture her, and so they walked into the palace like they owned it, without a worried thought, and marched up the massive steps. Gunray was excited. Anticipation of his victory washed over him, and then Jango struck. With a small posse of battle droids walking into the throne room, Captain Panaka and his guard fired into their ranks. The droids dropped, and Gunray panicked. He turned and yelled back for the battle droids outside the palace to do anything, and then he took a knee to the face before he could actually start running. Newt slammed into the ground and fell unconscious. Jango told them to take him away and tie him to the throne. Unfortunately though, as was just said, he was unconscious, which Fett wasn't going for. He was just trying to stop him from doing anything stupid, and now he was lying on the floor. Jango initially planned to force Gunray to call the Federation fleet to disarm the droid army. It would have probably created an entire list of problems for the bounty hunter because he'd be on their radar if he was the one, commencing the call. But this also provided him a unique opportunity to do some light sabotaging. While he wasn't familiar with Federation battle droids, specifically, he knew how most Type 1 droids worked. They were simple, unintelligent, and easy to confuse. So instead of negotiating a deal with the unconscious Newt Gunray, he told Panaka to keep him and the others locked away until he returned. The Royal Guard was becoming uneasy with all of these audibles called by the bounty hunter, but they had to play the part because Jango was the experienced killer, not them. From the roof of the palace, Jango scoped out the entire invasion force of battle droids in the center of Theed. They weren't going to move or go anywhere because they didn't have any orders. Jango didn't have the arsenal on his person to deal with this assault. He could use Slave 1 if he wanted, but he also wanted to make as many credits as possible. Destroying half the main street in Theed wouldn't be the most productive way of doing that. Something else had to be done. He looked through his materials on his person and thought about what he could do. Jango leaned back. He couldn't just attack this main force. He would never survive that. He currently couldn't just call the capital ship because he didn't have any leverage without Gunray conscious. So he paced around the structure, looking for something to do, something that could earn him his money, and then he saw a massive waterfall beside the palace. Of course, it was right there. Quickly and discreetly, he took to the air with his jetpack and attached each of the MTTs to each other using his extremely strong grapple cables. He then used his jetpack to get from tank to tank, but the droids didn't look up. When the jetpack went off, they questioned one another but never came to any conclusion. Once Jango got Panaka's reserve men to the back of the palace to set up a tiny perimeter, he brought the droids. The Mandalorian started a firefight with the battle droids by launching a rocket into an MTT's front, detonating it but not destroying it. A dozen or so droids were launched away in the blast, and the rest of them turned their attention towards Jango. It was a funny little moment. While he was too busy enjoying the explosion, he didn't notice all the other droids rushing him. He turned on a heel and fired back at the pursuing battle droids. Because he was able to distribute heavy ordnance on the MTT, the droids all chased after him. The MTTs started rolling forward, and regulars fired at Jango. He fired back at them with his pistols, and stopped periodically before reaching the little setup by Panaka. As soon as the battle droids were in firing range, Jango lifted off into the air and flew to the top of the pursuing MTT at the front of the line. He fired down at the battle droids around it, as the Royal Guards were able to use old walls to protect themselves. And fortunately for them, the droids were all in formation, making them much easier targets to hit. The guards didn't need to be super accurate to do any damage to the droid forces, and they were only the distraction anyways. Jango on top of the MTT ripped open the top of the tank, thanks to a circular laser device that opened it. It mimicked a lightsaber, but he could stick it to any device and then it would automatically do it while he shot anything else. Regardless, he leapt down into the cockpit of the tank, and flipped the engines on full and let it rush forward. He crushed the head of the battle droid controlling the vessel and lodged the head under the controls to keep the throttle moving. He then jetpacked out of the vessel and landed next to a droid, bashing his head in with his pistol and firing through its head into the droid behind it. Jango was unstoppable, and sure, he'd get hit here or there, but the Beskar was strong enough to deflect it and protect his body. He quickly got the remaining guards out of the way as the MTT rushed off the cliff and down the waterfall with every other tank still attached to it, trying to hold off until, one by one, the weight pulled each over the track. The guards followed Jango to the steps, where they picked off some other droids until the city became quiet. The Mandalorian sent the guards back to Panaka, while he personally intercepted the few AATs in the streets. He'd either use them to fire at other tanks or just immobilize them by killing their crew. Regardless of what it was that he did, Jango made quick work of these undefended tanks, and by the time he returned to the palace, it was time for negotiations. Nute Gunray was very unhappy with this performance by Jango Fett. He promised the bounty hunter that the Federation would annex his home world, and this didn't frighten Fett. Of course he didn't. He didn't care what Gunray did to Satine's world. But as far as Jango was concerned, it wasn't like Gunray would be doing anything to anyone anytime soon. So he suggested that he end this little blockade, leave Naboo, and never come back, before his trigger finger gets too itchy. Gunray tried to call the bluff, as he told Jango that if he died, there wouldn't be anywhere in the galaxy for the bounty hunter to run. With the removal of Jango's helmet, he dared Nute to try and act tough for another moment, and pretty immediately the Kid and Nemoidian man backed down. But there was always a swindle with Nute Gunray, so when they did agree to contact the Trade Federation and call off the blockade, he requested special assistance through a code. The Federation and the Sith had several contingency plans in case this invasion didn't work. The blockade itself would disperse, but the flagship would remain and wait for Gunray's return or escort. Jango wasn't interested in waiting around for the Republic to arrive. He wanted to make sure his job was complete and then he would leave. Once everything with the Federation was handled via communication, Jango would wait for the Queen to bring him his payment, and he'd bring Slave 1 to the Royal Hangar Bay so that he could leave. Not that Queen Amidala was dragging her feet, but she wanted to do more for Jango. It wasn't a big public ceremony by any means, but it was larger than what he wanted. Jango just stood waiting for his money, and instead, he was given credits, fine Naboo robes, delicacies, and food, with some other finer gifts that didn't fall under typical bounty hunter payments. Maybe it was naivety from Padmé, but honestly, Jango really appreciated it. He didn't want to wait around or anything, and even with his initial displeasure, he was genuinely warmed by this action. Being pampered for all of 5 seconds wasn't a sin, and it would never happen naturally as a bounty hunter, so he took advantage of the moment and simply enjoyed it. But all good things in this line of work never last. Despite defeating the Trade Federation and pushing them back, there was another problem. The secret code sent up to the flagship by Nute Gunray also came with the direction for a young assassin. Nute Gunray was currently waiting for the Republic escort from Coruscant to transport him from Naboo back to the capital so he could face punishment for his crimes. He knew he wouldn't have to wait that long, and before Jango could even abandon Naboo, he'd be forced into another engagement, this time with a foe unlike any he'd ever seen before. Fett knew how to fight a Jedi. He was even responsible for killing well over a dozen of them within the Mandalore system at one point or another. He was a very capable fighter, but the distress code given to the flagship requested for Darth Maul to arrive on Naboo to deal with this bounty hunter. Maul's instructions were simple: kill the royal guard and capture the Queen before the Republic arrived. None of the Sith knew that Jango was on the planet, because he wasn't listed in the surrender of Nute Gunray. To the Federation and the Sith, it looked like their overwhelming droid forces were convinced to bison run off the cliffs of Theed. That was a completely different concern for the Trade Federation, but for Jango, he had to look at a double-bladed crimson saber. The Zabrak Sith assassin rushed him, swinging his lightsaber swiftly. Captain Panaka and his guard pushed the Queen into protection, as the first line of men in the hangar bay fired at Maul. Jango was already in the air with his jetpack, blasting down without letting his opponent within striking range. Once he reached the other side of the bay, he pulled from his bag of tricks. Since Maul knew he couldn't have blasters firing at him from either side, he launched his saber into the Naboo guard, killing everyone not actively rushing the Queen to another location. They made it too easy for Maul because they were all lined up in a straight line pretty much. Jango lowered his shoulders and centered his gravity, basically challenging his Zabrak opponent. Maul took this very personally and rushed him. With his pistol in one hand and a grapple in the other, Jango rushed Maul. The crimson saber stabbed forward and Fett slid across the floor, attaching the grapple to the hip of Maul and pulling him once he got back to his feet. Maul was thrown to the ground before cutting apart the cable in anger. He rose to his feet and thrusted his hands forward, pushing Jango backwards with the Force. Maul knew better than to rely on the Force though. As a Zabrak warrior, he preferred to use as little of the Force in combat as possible. He wanted to win honorably and with power, by physically overpowering his opponent. Being that he was trying to kill a mere bounty hunter, his dedication to this style of combat was even more present. Maul shouldn't need the Force to kill a gunslinger. He would frown upon himself if he relied only on those advantages. He'd be a better warrior by killing Jango with just the saber. The Mandalorian bounty hunter grinned under the helmet. He loved a good challenge, and he no longer saw Maul like a Jedi, more of like a wild Rancor offspring. They were rambunctious creatures, but once you find their weaknesses, they're easy to bring down. He stepped forward, again pushing Maul to do something erratic. Maul raised his saber and spun it, before leaping in again. Jango ignited his jetpack and lunged into Maul, pushing his serrated wrist blade into Maul's collarbone. It cut deep, and Jango pulled back. His other forearm thrusted forward, protecting him from the following strike. The Beskar held just as it needed to, and Jango bashed his face into Maul's. His armored helmet knocked Maul's front horn off of his head into the ground, sending the Zabrak into a fit of fury. Jango played this into his favor, using his skill and experience with multiple Jedi to keep his distance and continue blasting away at his Sith foe. Maul was holding his own, even in defense, until all of that went out the window. From behind him, two sabers ignited. Surely Maul had his reinforcements, but instead, when he turned back to face those he thought to be his allies potentially, he saw two Jedi. Obi-Wan and Qui-Gon were on Naboo this entire time. They had only just arrived from the other side of the planet, and they ended up here. Qui-Gon demanded that the Sith stand down. Jar Jar from behind them was worried about what might happen, and then a blaster shot echoed out in the hangar bay. Maul's body hit the ground with a thud. Jango assumed that all three of these were Jedi, not really knowing the difference between a Jedi and a Sith. He just really assumed that Maul was a different type of Jedi. But when Qui-Gon called out to the Mandalorian telling him that they'd lower their weapons, Fett became suspicious. Typically, Jedi worked in packs, hence the semi-dishonorable murder of Darth Maul. Jango told them to stay back. Their friend attacked him first, and Master Jin, being the negotiator he was, explained everything to Jango. Maul was not one of them. He was a Sith. Jango had done a great service to the Jedi, the Republic, and the galaxy. Qui-Gon did want to know why he was here, but Fett told him he didn't answer to Jedi. Without another word shared between them, Jango took Slave 1 and departed from the hangar bay, leaving Naboo and the Jedi all together. It was a shame too. Queen Amidala would have loved to have given Jango more credits for the work he did for her, but there was no reason to complain or worry about it. Obi-Wan asked his master why they let the Mandalorian go, and it was simple. They had a case that proved the return of the Sith. They had far larger problems than a Mandalorian who didn't even live on Mandalore. The death of Maul would see the finalization of the Federation's failure at Naboo, and it was a pretty big deal too. Without the sympathy vote or the vote of no confidence from the Queen, there would be no removal of Chancellor Valorum. Now, he was as complacent as Republic Chancellors come, but he wasn't a total dud. He wanted to see the blockade come to a conclusion before making any radical decisions. He decided, following the invasion and the apprehension of Nute Gunray, that he would request emergency powers from the Senate, which he would receive. The bureaucrats of the Senate could be very easily swayed. One day they were all in Valorum's corner, another day they could be against him. It was anything that benefited the markets and the Republic. This was, in their eyes, beneficial to both. As the Queen promised, there'd be no mention of Jango Fett on any of her reports. Master Jin and Obi-Wan also made sure that no details of the Mandalorian's heroic acts made it off of Naboo. However, Qui-Gon needed to make a case to the High Council about what they saw. They had definitive proof that the Sith returned, and they should realistically do something about it. Even in their hubris, the wisest of the Jedi Order decided to agree. Maul's body was taken off of Naboo when the two Jedi returned to Coruscant. Padmé had no need for that body, plus she had a variety of discussions for the Chancellor, and without Palpatine in total control of the Senate, she could make her own input without his words. As one of her trusted advisors from Coruscant, Palpatine could always give her valuable suggestions, but it wouldn't be anything she would see as viable. Because the blockade, aside from the Sith interference, only came as a result of Valorum's trade route tax, Padmé knew that she could get more legislation against the Federation with Valorum. This was technically revenge. The Federation overstepped their boundaries, and something needed to be done about it. Palpatine suggested to Padmé a calmer, more diplomatic approach because they might see her as weak for demanding revenge, but she was furious, and for every right reason. Their homeworld was invaded, and if it weren't for the bravery of the quote-unquote royal guard, they'd be enslaved. And sure, Padmé paid out a huge sum of credits to Jango, but there was no need for that money. No one really knew where it went. The city needed minor repairs, and the population wasn't in total despair, so people just thought the money went to those repairs. These conversations, while long and dragging, resulted in both Gunray's actual imprisonment and the introduction of a set of bills to punish the Federation. If Valorum was going to have emergency powers for the rest of his term, then he would be using them to bring sweeping change to the Republic. Padmé wasn't the most influential voice in the room, by any means, but her experience with the Federation was at the end of a long list of other systems tortured by their expansion. It wasn't just the Trade Federation either, it was the other companies of similar size, getting away with too much influence. Well, from Valorum's point, no more. While the Republic reacted openly to this, the Sith, with 3 members again, dispatched Dooku to Kamino. Because Palpatine didn't become the Supreme Chancellor, he couldn't murder Plagueis in his sleep. It was disappointing for Sidious in many ways. He was very ready to become the sole Sith Lord, but now from his perspective, Plagueis was still his master. His first student was killed on Naboo by the Royal Guard somehow, and he didn't become Chancellor. It was a long few days, but they were about to get much, much longer. Tyrannus was instructed to hire Jango Fett for the clone trooper program. The Sith didn't know that he was capable of killing one of them, and despite Jango taking very little vacation for himself after his trip to Naboo, with all the credits he had from Amidala, he came to Kamino. It wasn't an actual bounty hunting mission, just a simple project, and that's why he took it. However, even though Dooku wore cloaks that looked like a Jedi and so forth, Jango was now paranoid because of his encounter on Naboo. He didn't fear the Sith, just as he didn't fear the Jedi. His issue was that the Sith were a far darker iteration of the Jedi, and Jango didn't need the Sith tracking him down, which is what he thought was happening right now. And while none of the ancient religion BS was important to Fett, he was concerned when he followed around a lightsaber-wielding man named Tyrannus. Jedi were always very negotiable. They always told it how it was. Jango may have not been overly fond of the Jedi. He may have chosen to let Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan live without trying to engage them, but he did not trust this Tyrannus figure here on Kamino, someone who had a lightsaber and didn't call themselves by the name Jedi. Fett's instincts were screaming at him from the moment he saw a lightsaber on Tyrannus' belt. So as they walked through the facility, talking about the needs of the Grand Army of the Republic, Jango planted his pistol to the back of Dooku's head and pulled the trigger. It was a genuine gut feeling. Something was extremely off about Tyrannus, and maybe he wasn't a Sith Lord, but there was no reason to risk it. A large reason for Jango's insane reaction came from the payment he received from Padmé. It wasn't nearly as many credits as he would receive for doing the Kamino and cloning project, but he was at least set for a year or two because of Queen Amidala. It was a job that put him into the mouths of mid-rim royals. That was a big deal, and one that would come with far more payments. So because he was set on credits and very paranoid of the Sith, Tyrannus was dead, and the other 2 Sith were left wondering why the Kaminoans would kill off their future business. Didn't really matter in the end though. The Sith didn't return to Kamino and were forced to make a decision on their own futures. That was the problem for the Sith now. They returned to the rule of 2 form. No longer did they have assassins or apprentices or back-pocket individuals. Tyrannus and Maul were both dead. There was no pathway to the chancellorship until Valorum left office, and the set plans for the Clone War were falling apart on them by the minute. Their singular opportunity to rise to immense influence was kind of over now. Plagueis personally wasn't sweating it. He was well over 100 years old. He knew this type of thing happened. They just needed to adjust their plans and prepare for something better. But even though Plagueis was calm and collected, his apprentice wasn't. It had to do with a couple factors, but the most important of them was the fact that his failure was thrown directly into his face on the daily. Every single day, Palpatine had to sit in Valorum's office and listen to his plans for crushing the Federation. Without Gunray, their board of directors were weak, and Lot Dod was begging for support. He typically had a very powerful presence because he was backed by the Federation, but the entire corporation was miscommunicating, so he accidentally said something inside the Senate that went completely against a different public statement that happened during the session. This misalignment between the corporation and the representative made it easier for Valorum to target and tear apart the TF. They were a sitting duck now, and with the Senate rallying around Valorum, it became easier to demonize Gunray and his Federation. To make matters worse for Palpatine, the only politician that would have challenged him if the vote of no confidence went through was rising through the ranks of the Senate. Bail Antilles from House Antilles on Alderaan was becoming very popular very quickly. People liked Palpatine, but the sympathy vote would have been incredibly important for a mid-rim senator going into an election cycle. Alderaan didn't frequently put up its senators for election for Chancellor, but it was clear that Antilles was making a statement. He sided with Valorum openly, and slowly, Bail became a more recognized voice inside the Senate than Palpatine. Sidious was forced to publicly backtrack on known stances of his, because he had populist views and so forth. It made him look weaker inside the Senate than he really was, and not for nothing, the Senate loved Alderaan, so their representative was the natural successor to a Coruscant-born Finis Valorum. The Senate was very core biased. The dagger for the Sith in the end wasn't Jango killing off Tyrannus or Maul, but what it always had been, themselves. Plagueis was too patient. He knew that they could again gain influence another way, but Sidious was furious. He wanted near immediate results, and it wasn't possible like that. It really wasn't anymore. And this wasn't even maturity from Palpatine's side. He had every reason to be irritated with Plagueis, because to a certain degree, he was playing things too safe. But Palpatine's master was also trying to make sure the Sith survived. His intentions were always in service of the greater goal of the Sith, whereas his eager apprentice cared more about himself. That fundamental issue with the Sith Empire of the Old Republic led to their downfall, and that too would lead to the collapse of the Rule of Two. Sidious would, after another argument about their plans, following the rise of Chancellor Bail Antilles of Alderaan, led to a lightsaber duel. Thanks to Plagueis being sober and fully functioning, he and his apprentice fought to the death, but no one actually died. Their duel resulted in Palpatine losing an arm, and Plagueis receiving burn marks across his body, but Sidious was still forced to flee. It was tragic because for Plagueis, he believed in the Rule of Two, so much so that he thought that they'd eventually win. Now from his lineage existed two entirely different splinter groups of the Sith Order. After all, it was Plagueis' first assassin, Kemir, who broke off to become the first Knight of Ren, and now Palpatine would begin his own new sect. But what that meant for the Sith and the Jedi were two completely different outcomes. Thanks to the rise of Bail Antilles, complementing an anti-corporation sentiment from inside the Senate, the Jedi were able to garner more influence. It was a result of their century-long distaste for the corporate representation growing inside the Senate. The Jedi didn't want their own reps inside the Senate, so Antilles was obliged to support the Order because of that. And while they never took up the influence they once held in the Golden Days, they were still regarded in a much more positive light, and they grew in popularity with Chancellor Antilles' 2 terms as Chancellor. The Sith, the actual line of Sith, running through Plagueis the Wise, ended up dying with him. He never really found a worthy apprentice after Palpatine. He would essence transfer and actually master the art of it, but he would never find an apprentice worth his time. It was because he saw so much value in Palpatine and couldn't fathom letting another individual with such remarkable power gaining such overconfidence, because it would destroy the Sith. In doing that, he destroyed the Sith himself. He would actually fight with Sidious one more time in his life too, and that would be the end of the second splinter group of the Sith, unintentionally created by his actions. Plagueis never gave up on his Sith-related aspirations. The only reason he failed was ironically the only reason Sidious wouldn't have. Plagueis, like the other members of the Rule of Two, cared far more about the religion of the Sith. He didn't let it get in his way. It was just a matter of the galaxy rapidly changing. Once former Queen Amidala became Senator of Naboo, there really wasn't anything for the Sith to hope for. Their plans, which had been in place most of Plagueis' life, no longer worked in a galaxy without corporate representation inside the Senate. Their one chance to find success passed them by. And while they could still have success, most of it relied on the invasion of Naboo. Sure, there were other chances, but never as great as that. It ironically, in the end, wasn't the Jedi or the Chosen One who brought an end to the Sith, but instead one hell of a gunslinger with no patience for religious funny business. And that, my friends, is kind of a neutral story. Special thanks to all the patrons for supporting the channel. Sith Clone Wars out on Saturday, you know what it is. Let's talk about this story though. First thing, Anakin's not in this story. He's not going to be referenced. This isn't his story. He's not going to get discovered in this. As for everything else, Jango versus Maul, I think is a duel he could win. I think it's a fight he could win. I think Maul in his Phantom Menace age would be able to be defeated. I think he was just too young. I think Maul from Clone Wars could win. I think those are two completely different engagements because Maul by that point has gained a patience. Maul in Phantom Menace I don't think has patience. I also thought it'd be kind of funny if Maul was trying to beat Jango honorably without using the Force, only for Jango to kill him dishonorably. I think Jango would just be so concerned that the other two Jedi were going to assist Maul, because I don't really think he would totally know the difference between them. I think the story has a lot of importance for the Rule of Two and the whole Sith plan. I thought it'd be really interesting to go to the route where, obviously I think if Dooku survives there's a different story here, but I also think that Jango's paranoia over the Sith would actually really play an important part in how he'd face Dooku. Though, for the Sith themselves, I think a lot of it hinges on the invasion of Naboo. I think without the corporate structure inside the Senate, the Sith wouldn't really be able to get ahead. Too much of the Clone War relies on the corporate alliances, and if the Senate actively turns against them with Valorum with emergency powers and an important senator like Baylan Tillis from Alderaan kind of backing it, I don't think there's really a place in the Senate for the Sith to grow or prosper. And I think at a certain point, Palpatine would actually grow impatient with his master and turn on him. And so that's where you get that like divide between Plagueis and Palpatine. I think Plagueis would just be like, alright, back to the drawing board. And I think Palpatine might be a little irritated with that. He had everything in his scripts, and I think that's why he would turn on Plagueis, despite not winning. I think he'd be impatient because he had everything. The invasion of Naboo was going to go right. He had Maul. That was going to be his future apprentice. He had Dooku. He was going to set up the Clone War, and then all of that was taken from him in like 3 days. And I think Plagueis would just be too much for him to handle by being like, oh, we gotta be patient. So I hope you all enjoyed the story. A little different in tone and style, but definitely more fun using someone like Jango and having him in the middle of a lightsaber duel rather than in the Jedi. So hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always, my friends, may the Force be with you.